As you can probably tell by the timing of this video, I'm a little bit late getting on board the Vampire Survivors train, but I've been playing it for a couple of days now. I've got a sense of the game and I've unlocked some bits of it, and I thought it was a really interesting example for us to look at of like how mechanics work together to kind of create an emotional effect of a game. So this is a video about Vampire Survivors, but it's also about a couple of different game design frameworks that you can use to think about games you're making, or just to analyze games that you like, to sort of understand how they do what they do. So first off, I've posed this question of, why is Vampire Survivors relaxing? Or at least, why am I finding it relaxing? And you may not find it relaxing. You might have different words to capture how this game makes you feel when you play it. And I think the word I'm really searching for when I say it's relaxing is something we call flow, really commonly used in games culture. It's used quite a lot in music as well. You'll hear rappers talk about their flow. But actually, when we use it in the context of game design, it is a proper kind of technical term. It comes from academic literature. And the author who you'd most commonly associate with this concept, or who've kind of founded it in terms of writing about it, was Michal Csikszentmihalyi, which is very hard to say. Flow is the state of doing an activity which is just right in terms of the level of challenge of the activity and your own level of skill. If you have high skill and the challenge is too low, then you are going to be bored, which is this bottom right quadrant of the flow diagram. And if you experience high challenge and your skill is low, you are going to feel anxious. So flow is this kind of middle passage between those two situations where the activity you're doing is just right for your level of skill. And you can sort of apply this to your own creative practice as well. If you're a game designer, or if you make any kind of media, you will get into a flow state while you're making something. And that's when the time dilation happens and you look up and suddenly you've been doing pixel art for 5 hours, or you've been mixing the volume of a snare drum in your song for 5 hours, or whatever it is. If you want a long form critique of flow theory and Csikszentmihalyi, then go and have a look at the Game Studies Study Buddies podcast over on Range Touch. They did a really good episode on flow, and there are quite a few key texts in game studies where Cameron and Michael on that podcast have given really good critiques. When I say Vampire Survivors is relaxing, actually what I'm trying to say is it puts me in a flow state, and it does it very well. And the main theories I want to talk about today are ways of kind of dismantling that and working out how we get from a game design, which is a set of mechanics, to those mechanics working together, and then me as a player feeling a certain way at the end of that. There are two sets of terminology that I'm going to use here. We've got game mechanics, which lead into dynamics, which are the mechanics working together in a particular way, which lead to aesthetics, which is a difficult word, which we're going to deal with in a minute. There is another way of looking at it, which is design, dynamics, and experience. And these are both like different models of the same theory, and the one that goes mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics is what's called MDA theory, not MDMA theory, which would be something different.
What are you selling?
A paper from Honique LeBlanc and Rubeck kind of outlines this way of formally understanding what is happening when a game is designed. When a player plays a game, they apprehend the game this way. They have an aesthetic experience, which, don't worry if you don't know what that means, I'll explain it in a minute. They start with an aesthetic experience, which means they experience a piece of art and have feelings about it. Then they see the game mechanics working together, and then they experience the mechanics as individual elements. Whereas a game designer works the opposite way. They put game mechanics together, those mechanics interact dynamically and form dynamics, and then that is what leads to an aesthetic experience for a player. One of the reasons why it's so difficult often to teach game design is that we are always trying to take someone who is a player, this green smiley face over here, and sort of invert their relationship with games so that they are able to build them from the ground up as mechanics, then dynamics and aesthetics. And a lot of people who start making games, they never really get to the point where they're able to think this whole chain of things through, because a lot of the time when you learn how to develop games, you are learning as an engineer. You're learning to program, you're learning how to put art together in an engine, and ultimately you kind of are putting features together that you like, or individual mechanics, and the ability to do this abstract thinking of thinking ahead about how these mechanics are going to go together, how they are going to dynamically interact, and then the next step of thinking of how is that going to make someone feel. Remember, aesthetics here is not about how it looks, although it relates to that. But when we're talking about the game design, we're just talking about, the aesthetic is the feeling of how all of these game mechanics working together kind of impacts us and makes us feel, right? That's a very hard thing to do, and it takes lots of practice, which is why I'm introducing this model to you today. Another way they formalized it is the mechanics are the rules of the game, the dynamics of the system where the rules fit together, like multiple rules working together, and then the end result is the fun. The game is a series of rules. Those rules work together in a particular way, and the way that those things work together creates a particular emotional response, and then the emotional response is going to be sort of amplified by other aesthetic decisions about how the game is built. So this is where things like art and sound design and narrative are going to interact with the gameplay and kind of further create this aesthetic effect on someone, which is like, if it's a horror game, then that's going to mean it looks a particular way, which makes it scary, and it also plays a particular way, which makes it scary. Now, the MDA model can be quite useful if you understand what all the words mean, but people have an idea of what aesthetics means already, which is not the same as how we would use it in academia or in philosophy in general. So aesthetics to most people means a visual style. If I look up aesthetics, it's like, what does something look like? And does it look good? It's applied to cosmetics. It's applied to kind of like these kind of things, subgenres of art movements. Like, here's what Outrun looks like. Here's what Vapor Synth looks like. But aesthetics in philosophy is the study of beauty and taste. And it's not just about the object that you can see, right? The piece of art or the music video, whatever it is you're looking at. It's also about what happens when someone perceives it, right? What happens to them emotionally as a result of interacting with that piece of art. One of the best examples of this that you can use from pop culture is like kawaii in Japanese. And I'm sorry if any of these images that are coming up are AI dross. Google is just broken now. But in Japanese culture, you have this concept of kawaii, which is cute, right? But it is not just how the thing looks, it's also how it makes the audience feel when they look at it. And that's what we mean when we talk about aesthetics, when you're in like an art history class or in a context where it's a bit more philosophical. It's how does the kind of form and the content of a piece of artwork kind of translate into an emotional, affective experience for a person, right? So there's a kind of psychological element going on as well. Are you going to become an annoying philosophy of art person and go around and correct people about what aesthetics means now? I hope so. I do. So that's kind of the caveat here, is that when we are talking about aesthetics in MDA, we're not necessarily just talking about how it looks. That could be an element, but in the terms of the gameplay, we're talking about how the player feels when they play this. And this is all bringing us back round to that question of, why do I feel relaxed when I play a game that looks so frantic? And I will put links to all of these papers in the video description. Go and take a look at those if you want to read through them. Hopefully that's a helpful resource if you need it. Now, just to add, there was an adaptation to MDA where they kind of reformulated the theory into this other model, DDE, which is Design Dynamics Experience. I think if I wanted to combine these, right, I could make a third model, copyright Dr. Joe Baxter Webb today, and I'll just merge them. They've both got dynamics in the middle, but we can have the design of the mechanics on the end and then an aesthetic experience. It's fine, just put them into one model. Here's how you can actually use this to help you to understand a game. So what I'm going to do is look at my footage from my last playthrough of the game and talk about these elements in relation to it. Player auto attacks. Right? The player auto attacks The player can move. Enemies, they generally move towards the player. That's not necessarily what happens in later levels. They generally don't have very complex movement patterns, and enemies drop XP sometimes. There will be a bunch of mechanics in this game as well that are to do with the meta progression, that are to do with like what happens 2 hours into the game, what happens when you've played it a certain amount of times. Not going to look at those here because it would just take too long, but also it's kind of more helpful. Okay, here we go. We've got to level up. We get enough XP, we level up. And interestingly, XP in a lot of games is an intangible resource. You just get it. It's not an item that drops on the floor. Here, it's an item that drops on the floor, and you can already start to think about how that changes the gameplay, how it incentivizes the player to move around the space in a different way. But if we were going to talk about that, we would be talking about dynamics, which we're not talking about yet. The enemies drop XP sometimes, right? Not always. Not every enemy drops one. And the pickups, which include the XP, but also things like coins and chests, pickups do not expire, which I would say is a core mechanic here and has some significance in terms of other things in the game. Weapons, tools are very different from each other. There is a concept in design called orthogonal design. Just making myself a note to give you a link to another person's video on orthogonal design, which I think is wonderful. But basically, the idea of orthogonal design is if you have a set of things like 10 weapons or whatever, on orthogonal design, they are all very different from each other. They move differently. It is not just a matter of some numbers being different. And one of the things that gives this game its particular flavor when you're playing it is that every weapon has a slight different logic to it. Some weapons pierce, some weapons kind of fling out in a particular way. Some weapons, and then there are kind of the numerical things like faster or slower cooldowns, but each one really feels different in terms of how it moves and how it animates. And then there are things that are very specific to this first play area, like how open it is. That does change when you unlock other areas of the game. But in this kind of first instance, I would hesitate to call it an open world game because that means something specific and very different. But here it is it's open, right? There isn't a level in the sense we would normally understand it. And it's not trying to simulate a real place. It is almost like a football pitch. It's just a big arena in which to do the activity of the game. There are a couple of other core mechanics here we could possibly put on our list, but as we move through the video, a lot of the things I can observe are really going to be coming into the area of dynamics, of like how things kind of interact. I would say that the things that really define this as a genre are that it's an auto-attacking game, right? The only thing I control is the movement, and there are points when I get to choose what to level up with and all of that kind of stuff, and where it pauses and I get a chest and all of these kind of things, but I'm only ever doing one thing at once. And when I'm fighting, I am just moving. And then when I am dealing with any kind of upgrading, leveling up stuff, I am not doing the fighting and moving. It pauses, right? The reason that works so well and isn't boring is there are loads of things for me to process as a player, for me to look at and make judgments on. So, if I've got the axes and they're flying out the top, then I might deliberately move under enemies. If I have the garlic that gives me like a little AoE, then I might deliberately pinpoint the enemies I know are weaker and push through them and try and kind of melt through that wall. There are lots of split-second decisions happening in this game because of the way the pickups fall on the ground and stay where they are, because of the way the enemies are so legible. As once I've played the game a few times, I know which of these enemies are going to one-shot and which of them are going to put up a bit more resistance. There are so many easily legible, and when I say legible, I mean like visible, something I can read as a player. There's no kind of, this enemy looks exactly like this enemy, but this one has twice as much health, right? It's very easy as a player to develop a mental map of this game and to know, okay, I can one-shot the bats, and you know, these other enemies, I can kill them in 3 or 4, but I can't just run straight into them with the weapons I've got at the moment. I need to hold back. Combination of these things, the combination of very clearly legible enemies and weapons that all behave slightly different, create this dynamic where the simple act of moving around actually gives me quite a lot to think about, because I'm thinking about the interaction between my character, which is, you know, this stack of different auto-attacking weapons that do different things, and the environment as it currently is, which is an assemblage of all the enemies on the screen, which I can look at and, you know, read as kind of like a heat map of, oh, there's some squishy enemies over there and some hard enemies over there. And also the kind of desire layer of the map, which is, where's all the shiny that I need to pick up, right? There's lots of things going on there, and that means that the simple mechanic of moving the player character becomes a really rich space in the player's mind in terms of the decision they're making. That's what's going on. So let's take a look at this dynamics column and think about some of the stuff that goes there. So a dynamic that I would think of putting here is I am only ever doing one thing at a time. I'm not in combat when I'm selecting something. This is like a core dynamic of the game. And you could, you know, it's probably going to get a bit messy if I try to chain these things through, but you can imagine how several of these mechanics would feed into that. And let me just do a little. So, and then we could say something like, the battlefield evolves in terms of risk reward. I don't know a better way to say that off the top of my head, but think of what I just said. I look at the screen, there are loads of XP gemstones over on the right hand side, and there are particular types of enemies scattered around, and all of these things are feeding together to give me a situation to read and react to as a player, right? And again, because I'm only ever doing one thing at a time, my response to my read of the situation is just to push a stick around and maneuver myself, right? I don't have to think about triggering any other moves. I'm just moving around in and out of space, and that's part of what makes this game compelling. So the mechanic that enemies drop XP and that pickups do not expire feed into this evolving battlefield, right? And the enemies moving towards the player is there. And later on, we do have some other types of enemies that don't move how you'd expect. Like the bats are a really good example of this. You have the regular bats that come towards you, and then you have the swarms of bats. And they sort of, I think they head for the player, but they kind of lag in terms of understanding where the player is. So they tend to pass you. And then later on, you get the same thing with ghosts and probably other types of things later on. Those are examples of enemies that don't move directly towards the player. They're also an example of another dynamic that I see in this game, is that as you power up, threats become opportunities. And I think one of the most satisfying moments in this game, or at least in the early stages of this game, one of the things that lots of people will experience that gets you hooked is seeing one of those swarms of bats, or maybe it's the skeletons, maybe it's when you get a cloud of skeletons around you, and realizing that you are powerful enough to push through it and like melt it like a knife through butter. It is so satisfying. And it's not just the fact that you can kill a bunch of enemies reasonably easy when you thought you were going to die. It's the fact that 5 minutes earlier you would have died in that situation, right? And you've got the sense of your power increasing, but you've also got this kind of smugness about, oh, I read that situation correctly, right? I sort of edged in, I killed some stuff, and then I thought, oh, hang on, I can do this, and I pushed through it and came out the other side. And that is really satisfying. And again, there are ways that these specific mechanics are working together to produce that feeling. So I think, based on what I've just said, I'm going to have to start putting things in the aesthetic column, because There's a sort of satisfying, self-satisfying, almost smugness to when you do well in this game that I think belongs over there. And you could see this feeding into that, right? So as I just talked about, when you have something earlier in the game that would kill you very easily and then you just melt it, that is an example of this dynamic becoming an emotional response in the player, right? One of the other dynamics I've noticed in this game is that enemies sort of do not arrive at the same time each time you play, but sometimes they arrive together in a particular formation that sort of temporarily ups the difficulty. So you've got these green ghosts that are quite hardy. They're very slow, but they take lots of hits. And at the same time of these, you've got these kind of mud man looking ghouls. And those guys are easy to one-shot. So this creates another dynamic, right? In it, the mechanics of basically having enemies that move at different speeds and have different health and stuff, and having enemies that are easy to tell apart, right? Because if all these enemies look the same and some of them just had 1 health and some of them had 100 health, that's not the same experience for a player as making it very visually clear which enemies are really easy to melt in that situation. Here we have these enemies that are just really tough at the level you're at, and then in between the gaps you've got a couple of enemies who are very easy to one-shot, and they're going to drop an XP on the floor, but you're not going to be able to get it because the ghosts are going to walk over it. So you have this kind of circling around behavior. You kind of clear out most of an area, but the enemies you're currently on are a little bit too hard for you, so you walk away and you snake round, and hopefully by then the mob has moved and you can go back to where you remember your XP dropping on the floor and pick it back up. You can already see how these kind of chains of mechanics, as they kind of knot into a dynamic, become very difficult to pick apart. There are so many game mechanics feeding into a particular dynamic that the way I've presented it in my left to right flow stops working, because you actually need like a big spider chart of things, not even a spider chart, I don't know what you would call that, just a regular kind of mind map of things flowing into others. Enemies spawn differently each time. And I would put, just generally speaking, this kind of encompasses a couple of different mechanics and some sort of art and visual decisions, but I'm going to put enemies are predictable. When you see a particular enemy, you know what they're going to do after you've learned. You sort of know that that enemy is a tougher enemy that moves at a particular speed. So if it you know, it's kind of like the opposite of how the weapons are designed, right? Every weapon is very, very unique. The enemies are much simpler, and that is again tying into this situation where the battlefield is very easy for you to read. There's lots going on, and there's these multiple layers of, like, there's the rewards on the floor and then the threats on top of it, and the threats are also, you know, a kind of reward, because if you can spot the area where all the weaker enemies are, like the clouds of bats, you can take out a bunch in one go, pick up a load of XP, and then run away from the harder enemies. These are all dynamic things that are the result of the set of mechanics that are in place. And if you're new to game design or analysis, another way of approaching this exercise would be to put your emotions on the right hand side and then work back. So another emotion I feel when this game is, I kind of feel creative. And I know that's a weird thing to say, but there is something about picking a set of weapons and getting an unusual combination of weapons that to me feels creative. The weapons being orthogonally different kind of eventually feeds into that sense of feeling creative, because you've stacked them together, and it's kind of, you've played the game 3 times in a row, and each time you've played it, it's felt a bit different to move the character around, because again, the way that the weapons behave means that you are incentivized to move around differently depending on your loadout. So I've put here, you move differently to accommodate your loadout in the current game state. So again, it's sort of like thinking of, what weapons do I have? Remember, they're orthogonally different, so I might have one character that is slightly stronger, attacking in a particular direction or attacking at a certain range, and that is going to lead to me moving around differently. And that is also a result of the enemies being predictable and easy to read, right? Because if you had this game, but all of the enemies had like high-end AAA game AI, like looking at a little goblin and having to take into account all of these variables about what the goblin might do in different situations, and that's just not there because the goblins just run at me. And this is kind of a quintessential thing about AI in games, is that often we do not want enemies in games to be smart because we need them to be predictable in certain ways for the game to work, and some of that is a matter of genre. Like, enemies in a stealth game need to be intelligent in a particular way or have the appearance of a certain type of intelligence, and dumb in other ways. And other genres are going to have different needs for the enemies in terms of like how smart we want them to seem in different ways. And this is an example of like where the enemies need to be absolutely predictable, because the dynamic of the game and how these different other mechanics work together starts to fall apart if the enemies are smart. Now, the chart I've been building throughout the course of this video isn't perfect, but it doesn't need to be, because it's just here to show you how the model works. And if you are a kind of gamer who is just getting into building or analyzing games, you can start on the right hand side. You can start from the aesthetic thing of, you know, when I play Silent Hill, I feel scared, and then work back through, right? And you might find that the things that make you scared are like resource scarcity. That's one that people always talk about in terms of horror games, is the fact that, okay, there's combat in this game, but you can't fight everything. And one of the reasons you can't fight everything is because you don't have enough ammo for all of the enemies in the game. A horror game with infinite ammo kind of ceases to be a horror game. It might have some of the aesthetic trappings of a horror game, right? It might have a particular art direction that makes us feel a bit gross, or, you know, enemies that look a particular way that's unpleasant, and that might create some sort of disgust or revulsion or horror. But the gameplay itself needs to have certain mechanics to create dynamics that lead to the experience of being scared. Otherwise, the gameplay itself is not scary. It's just an action game with some visually scary stuff layered on. People talk about the Resi series in those terms quite a lot, right? When you hit Resi 4, it becomes an over-the-shoulder shooting game. And of course, it's still got its scary moments, but it's not what a lot of horror fans would consider a pure horror game for that reason. So, if you are making a game, which you probably are if you're watching my channel, then you might be thinking, what is the use of this? What is it useful for? And I would advise you to look at the genre you're working in and look at the games it's inspired by, and use this tool to think about why the elements that are in the original games are there, right? So if you're making a Metroidvania and you're doing it because you love Hollow Knight, don't just go through Hollow Knight like a checklist of things and reproduce them. You need to be able to look at the different mechanics, how they work together, and how they produce particular effects. And some of it might be, okay, well, you know, I can see how those things work together, and that creates this risk reward or whatever kind of dynamic that leads to a good experience for the player. But it might be that you want that risk reward to come from something else. So you take one mechanic out, you put another mechanic in, you shift things around a little bit, and you still have that satisfying risk reward, but it's in a different place in the game. But you can only start to do this stuff intentionally if you can see how it is working in existing games. And that's one of the reasons why it is so important for designers to play games. And by that, I do not mean play the same game for 100 hours. I mean, if you're working in a genre, pick 10 games in that genre and play them all and see how they do things differently. You know, don't make a top-down action game based on Hades and only base it on Hades, because even if you copy it mechanic for mechanic and make a really good clone, you're not going to understand how it works. In order to make something innovative and new that people are going to want to play, you really need to be able to design deliberately, and that means that you look at Hades and you look at Cult of the Lamb and you look at how they do things slightly differently in terms of their combat, while still kind of being in the same genre space, and then you're able to look at how this game did this and this game did this and kind of weigh up which way you want to do, right? Because if you're just looking at one game for inspiration rather than multiple, then you just have to trust that the way that that game did the thing is the best way available, and that's not how you make the best version of the game that you are trying to make. I'm Dr. Joe Baxter Webb. This is the Indie Game Clinic. I make videos using my experience both teaching and doing game design for years and years and years. And if you want to support this channel, you can join our Discord. We've got memberships through the Patreon. It's a nice environment because basically whenever I feature a game on this show, developers are invited to the Discord. So it's a mixture of kind of my patrons and people who I've had on the show, which makes it a very unusual place in terms of online game development forums, because basically the vast majority of people in that Discord have actually made a game, at least to the demo stage. And I find that really valuable as a type of community, because the problem with game dev is like every place you can go is filled with people just kind of asking, which engine should I use? How do I get started? And questions that have been answered hundreds and hundreds of times, and it's very difficult to get to the point where you're having kind of more in-depth conversations about how do I make a game that is actually going to be fun and that people are going to decide to play, you know, put down their favorite game and pick up my one. It's very hard to get to that kind of more intermediate level of thinking about game design when you are in an environment where everyone is just kind of asking, how do I get started? 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 I really think that Discord is a valuable resource, but you can also donate £1 a month. If you don't want to come in my Discord because you think I smell. If you don't want to do that, I've got a bunch of merch on the channel that you can buy that have funny little game developer jokes on. Yeah, you should also subscribe to the channel, but you've done that already because you're very smart, and that's why you're here, and that's why you've watched this video all the way through. So thanks for joining us, and see you soon for more game design chat. Why did I wink? I don't know why I winked. Sorry.